It began in the dark, not in a shipyard ceremony or on a sunny postcard of steel and flags, but in a strip of black water that sailors had started calling Iron Bottom Sound. The night north of Guadalcanal was overcast, starless, almost deliberately hiding everything that floated on its surface. To the naked eye, there was nothing, no horizon, no silhouettes, only the muted growl of engines and the hush of waves against steel. But inside one ship, high above the armored deck, another world existed. On the plotting table aboard an American battleship that most history books barely mention, pale green traces slid across a radar screen. Each soft echo marked something real: a destroyer, a cruiser, a column of ships moving with purpose. They were Japanese. They did not know they were being watched. The ship tracking them was no background escort, no passive guardian of carriers. She was large, fast, heavily armed, wired with technology so new that many senior officers still didn't quite trust it. To official doctrine, she was a shield. To the man commanding her that night, she was a blade. The radar operators called out bearings in low, control voices. Range: 20,000 yards. Then 18,000. The contacts were closing, sliding into an invisible net. Outside, the sea was featureless. Inside, every few seconds the antenna swept and painted the truth: a Japanese bombardment force advancing toward Guadalcanal, preparing to silence the airfield that kept the Marines alive on that island. The battleship's crew knew what had happened here just days earlier. American cruisers and destroyers had charged into a night action without this kind of clear electronic picture, without a heavy unit like this one unleashed. The result had been confusion, collisions, friendly fire, and broken hulls on the bottom. Tonight, the same waters waited. The Japanese believed the pattern would repeat. Quick night strikes. Heavy shells walking across an airstrip. Transports sliding in behind them with fresh troops. Another step toward pushing the United States back into the Pacific. But tonight something was different. This time, one ship with a quiet admiral and an unglamorous name had slipped into the story. Her hull number was known. Her silhouette was familiar to her crew. Yet decades later, when people list the iconic American battleships of the war, they mention the symbols. The one in the harbor where the conflict began, the one where it ended, the sleek Iowas with their showpiece reputations. This one rarely comes up. She was not the first of her kind. She was not the last. She did not host a surrender, and she did not become a tourist landmark. She did something harder to brand. On one critical night, she did exactly what a battleship had been built to do in the age of machines, and then was quietly pushed out of the spotlight for proving too much. As the blips crept closer, the man overseeing the operation leaned closer to the radar plot. Rear Admiral Willis A. Lee, short, round-shouldered, glasses sliding down his nose, did not look like anyone's idea of a legendary sea warrior. But he understood something many did not. This green glow on the screen was more powerful than searchlights, more decisive than big speeches. He listened, measured, and waited. Around him, men at their stations felt the tension coil. They were about to take a ship that had never once used its main battery in combat against another warship and drive it straight into a place the charts now annotated with resting hulls. The irony was sharp. Official doctrine said battleships were outdated in this new age of carriers. Yet here, in this black water, an outdated ship about to be used in a role doctrine had almost abandoned was the only thing standing between Guadalcanal and disaster. The admiral gave one simple order: hold fire. Let them come. To understand why this particular ship story has been almost forgotten, you first have to understand how wrong the United States Navy almost was about its own tools. On paper, the battleship was everything a nation could ask for: heavy armor, long-range guns, speed enough to keep up with fast carriers. Our underrated protagonist embodied that logic perfectly. Over 700 feet of steel. 3 main turrets, each mounting triple 16-inch rifles capable of sending a single shell farther than some field guns could dream. A layered citadel of armor wrapped around her magazines and machinery. Turbines that could drive her close to 28 knots, impressive for such mass. If you drew the ideal all-rounder for a fleet in the late 1930s, she was the sketch that became real. And then, just as she arrived, the world changed. Pearl Harbor put carrier aviation at the center of every conversation. Air groups, not gun calibers, became the measure of worth. The new fast battleships were hastily rebranded in doctrine: anti-aircraft platforms, screens, escorts. Valuable, yes, but as guardians, not hunters. So while submarines stalked shipping and carriers flung aircraft hundreds of miles, this ship spent her early service underused. She trained. She crossed oceans. She worked beside the British home fleet, learning cold northern seas. She drilled her gunners, her radar teams, her damage control parties. For all her potential, she rarely did anything a cruiser could not have done more cheaply. Her main battery stayed silent, as if the Navy were almost embarrassed to let a battleship be a battleship. The logic seemed sound for a time. When battleship admirals wanted a classic gun duel, carrier proponents pointed to Midway and said, "Those days are over." When junior officers suggested using radar-equipped heavy units aggressively at night, they were told not to risk capital ships in secondary roles. Then came Guadalcanal. That island was not just jungle and red mud. It was a test of whether the United States could hold a foothold in the Pacific at all. Henderson Field, carved from the ground and barely held, allowed American aircraft to strike by day. But at night, Japanese ships moved in, using their expertise in darkness and long-range torpedoes to shell the airfield and land reinforcements. One of those early night battles had already gone terribly wrong. American cruisers and destroyers, brave but blind, had charged into a superior Japanese force. The fight became a short-range tangle of silhouettes and searchlights. Ships on both sides fired at shapes without certainty. When the sun rose, wreckage drifted, crews were missing, and Henderson Field was still under threat. High Command read the reports. They saw that doctrine, protect the carriers at all costs, keep the battleships leashed, had left surface forces underpowered at the exact moment a firm hand was needed. But even then, there was hesitation. To send a modern battleship alone into those waters went against everything senior officers had been taught. It broke the rules carefully crafted in classrooms far from the smell of fuel and cordite. Yet reality doesn't grade on doctrine. Intelligence now indicated another Japanese force assembling, a battle group built around a reconstructed battlecruiser, heavy cruisers, destroyers, and transports carrying thousands of troops. Their mission was direct: neutralize Henderson Field so completely that the Marines would be isolated and overrun. If they succeeded, months of sacrifice on the island would be erased. Two options sat on the table. Keep the fast battleships close to the damaged carrier, guarding what remained of precious flight decks, and accept that Guadalcanal might fall. Or break the rulebook and send a battleship division into Iron Bottom Sound alone, to fight a night action against an enemy famous for winning night actions. In that moment, the undervalued ship finally received the order she had been built for. She would go in with a sister ship and a thin screen of destroyers. They had never fought together as a unit. Their radios did not fully match. Procedures were improvised. Time for rehearsal did not exist. On her bridge, calm under round spectacles, Willis Lee accepted the mission with an almost understated certainty. While others saw a gamble, he saw a laboratory where 6 months of obsessive training in radar gunnery and night fighting could be proven. He had quietly transformed his flagship from a symbol of old thinking into a prototype of the future. Direct radar feeds to fire control. Streamlined communication from detection to trigger. Drills until operating in darkness with only instruments felt natural. Now, ahead lay the still water, Savo Island's dark shape, and beyond it, the approach vector of the Japanese task force. The most underrated battleship in the American fleet was finally aimed not at a distant horizon to be guarded, but at an enemy line to be broken. The column slid past the outline of Savo Island like a procession of shadows. 4 destroyers in the lead, then the 2 big ships, first the undervalued veteran, then her newer sister, moving at a steady pace. No signal lamps flickered.
No searchlights probed.
Only the low vibration of turbines and the quiet murmur of orders carried by sound-powered phones. Below the bridge, deep inside the forward superstructure, Washington's radar rooms glowed green. Operators leaned over their scopes, tracing the faint arcs and blips that meant everything. They saw what lookouts could not: a Japanese formation approaching from the northwest, spread out, confident, unaware that they were already inside someone else's map. Multiple contacts. Range, 20,000 yards, closing. Willis Lee listened without interrupting. He had been preparing for this moment in ways that did not involve speeches. Months earlier, he had rearranged procedures so that radar data flowed directly into fire control instead of being diluted through layers of relays. Tonight those choices turned into seconds saved, confusion avoided. The Japanese task force under Admiral Kondo was built for exactly this kind of work. At its heart moved Kirishima, rebuilt from an older battlecruiser into a fast battleship, 8 14-inch guns, quick enough to keep up with cruisers and destroyers. Around her clustered heavy cruisers Adago and Takaro, light cruisers, and destroyers armed with Type 93 long-lance torpedoes, whose range and explosive power had already stunned Allied crews earlier in the campaign. For years, the Imperial Navy had trained to own the night. Lookouts selected for exceptional vision. Rehearsed searchlight drills. Perfected torpedo spreads launched from unseen angles. The darkness, to them, was not a hazard but an ally. They had used it against cruisers off Java, against forces at Savo Island, against convoys across wide seas. What they did not expect was a battleship that treated the night the way they treated daylight. Washington's SG radar painted their approach cleanly. Her Mark 8 fire control radar could turn that picture into a firing solution faster than experienced gunnery officers armed only with optics. Where the Japanese philosophy imagined closing to visible distance and using human skill to carry the action, Lee's team prepared to let machines carry the calculation and human judgment decide when to trust them. And yet, even with that advantage, Lee did not rush. He knew that if he opened fire too early, the Japanese force might turn away before committing to the run toward Henderson Field. They might scatter, leaving the transports a chance to slip in later. To protect the airfield and the Marines, he had to do more than land a blow. He had to break this attempt completely. So he waited, driving his formation deeper into the Sound. The destroyers ahead, Walk, Benham, Preston, Gwyn, were the point of the spear and the shield in front of it. Their skippers knew the odds. To get their torpedoes into play, they would have to nose close to an enemy famous for exactly that kind of short-range work. Behind them, South Dakota and Washington loomed invisible, their darkened hulls blending into the night. On the scopes, the range ticked downward, 18,000, 16,000, 14,000 yards. The Japanese, focused southward toward the island and the airstrip they intended to neutralize, still had not recognized the pattern of contacts behind Savo as two American battleships. To them, any opposition was expected to be small cruisers and destroyers, just as before. They were following last week's script. At 11 p.m., Lee made his choice. He had allowed them as far in as he dared. Open fire, came the order. Washington's main battery had waited since commissioning for that sentence. Now 9 16-inch rifles elevated in unison, aimed not by guessing at muzzle flashes but by the precise, invisible geometry of radar and analog computers. The first salvo roared out toward a Japanese light cruiser contact, shells vanishing into the dark, trajectories drawn only on plotting boards and in the imaginations of men who knew where they would fall. The night that had once belonged to one navy had just become a testing ground for a different way of fighting. The first salvos distant impacts threw white columns of water around an unseen hull. The Japanese formation realized in an instant that this was not another confused skirmish with light forces. Those were battleship shells, arriving from a direction where no battleship was supposed to be. Searchlights snapped on. Star shells bloomed overhead, washing the Sound in hard, artificial daylight. Beams swept across waves and wreckage from previous nights, probing for the source of those heavy reports. But light cuts both ways. The instant a Japanese destroyer and then a cruiser illuminated, Washington's plotting teams had crisp visual confirmation to match their radar picture. Corrections flowed. The second and third salvos tightened. Out in front, the American destroyers were already in motion. Walk led the charge, followed by Benham, Preston, and Gwyn, racing toward the flashes, trying to put their own slim silhouettes between the oncoming Japanese force and the big ships behind them. Their role was as harsh as it was simple: disrupt, draw attention, fire torpedoes, and absorb the first storm. They did it without hesitation. Japanese gunners, trained for this kind of close action, shifted to the nearer, smaller shapes daring toward them. Heavy and medium shells found the thin-skinned leaders. Walk shuddered under multiple hits. Preston was bracketed, then wrapped in flame. Benham took a torpedo that tore away her bow yet somehow remained afloat, stubbornly refusing to give up buoyancy. Gwyn staggered under impacts but still maneuvered, still searching for survivors where she could. The screen that had marched so neatly into the Sound was now fragmented, some ships burning, some slowed, some fighting to control damage. But their sacrifice had done something crucial. They had drawn fire and attention away from where Washington still moved in partial shadow. South Dakota, just astern of Washington when the action began, advanced into the chaos. She was powerful, new, ready, and suddenly vulnerable. A cascading electrical fault triggered by an attempt to isolate a minor issue cut power to key systems. Lights flickered, went out. Radar screens died. Directors froze. In an instant, One of the Navy's most modern battleships was struggling to fight by local control alone, her elegance reduced to something much closer to pre-war conditions. In the harsh glare of Japanese searchlights, South Dakota's outline stood out cleanly. Kirishima, Adago, Takaro, and their escorts focused on her. Shells converged. Impacts walked across her upper works, smashing antennas, damaging secondary mounts, cutting away her electronic eyes. She remained afloat, her armor doing its central job, but she was now lit, isolated, and absorbing punishment. From the Japanese perspective, this was confirmation. Here was the main threat, and it was being contained. They still had not seen Washington. Hidden by her position, by careful maneuvering, and by the bright spectacle around South Dakota, Washington passed momentarily unnoticed on many enemy bridges. On her own, however, nothing was unclear. Radar tracked each firing Japanese ship separately. One contact bright, consistent, central, Kirishima. Lee saw it. So did his gunnery team. Here was the core of the bombardment plan, the ship whose guns, if allowed to continue south, would walk explosive patterns across Henderson Field. Remove her, and the entire intent of the Japanese sortie would unravel. At that moment, Lee faced a choice very different from the one on any war college diagram. His destroyers were battered. His partner battleship was partially blinded and under concentrated fire. The neat battle line any textbook would demand simply did not exist. Conventional wisdom said break off. Save the one fully functional capital ship. Preserve strength for another day. Lee looked instead at the radar plot, at the disordered scattering of Japanese tracks, at the single clear symbol for Kirishima crossing his predicted gun arcs, and made a decision that fit none of the preconceived categories. Washington would go forward alone. Maintain radar silence to all but fire control. Steady on new course. Target, principal enemy heavy unit. She accelerated into the gap. Hull knifing past the places where Walk and Preston had been only minutes before. Her crew felt the change, not panic, not bravado, but the focused stillness that comes when training and reality finally match. At 8,400 yards, close range for her big rifles, comfortably within the precision envelope of her radar solutions, Washington's forward turrets locked.
Commence firing.
9 16-inch guns spoke together, and this time, the shells were not just a demonstration of range. They were aimed at a specific heart of steel and machinery, at a ship whose crew was still focused southward, their searchlights trained on the wrong giant. In those first seconds of Washington's solo attack, the most underrated battleship in the American fleet stopped being an escort, stopped being a footnote, and became exactly what her designers had imagined, and what history almost refused to admit she had been. The first broadside landed like a verdict. Kirishima's own searchlights, still locked on South Dakota, framed her beautifully on Washington scopes. Every adjustment from the Mark 8 radar, every correction from the fire control computer, turned into real arcs of steel crossing the sky. At that distance, with that clarity, Washington's main battery team was operating in their ideal environment. Numbers exact, picture stable, target unaware of the true direction of danger. The opening salvo straddled. Immense pillars of water rose so close along Kirishima's length that her bridge shuddered from the concussion. Her crew, trained and brave, reacted fast, helm orders, attempts to maneuver, calls to track the unseen attacker, but the second salvo was already in flight. This time, heavy shells found their mark. Impacts along Kirishima's forward areas disrupted her ability to answer cleanly. Another hit affected her machinery spaces. Another struck near her steering, throwing her off balance. Light and medium splinters swept exposed positions. Within moments, she began to respond sluggishly to helm orders, then not at all, her bow starting an uncommanded swing. Washington's gunnery officers saw the subtle drift reflected instantly on their plots. Corrections went in. Salvos 3, 4, 5 followed in disciplined rhythm. At close to 2 rounds per minute per gun, 9 rifles turned into a continuous sequence of calculated blows. The Japanese flagship of the mission was now circling unintentionally, lights still on, outlined against her own glare. Washington's secondary battery, 5-inch dual-purpose guns controlled by their own directors and radar, joined in. Their faster rhythm walked precise bursts along Kirishima's upper works, disrupting control positions, rangefinders, and communication lines. This was not random shooting. It was methodical removal of an opponent's sensors and coordination. Around them, the rest of Condor's formation felt the balance invert. Adago and Takaro swung searchlights toward the new threat and finally caught Washington's silhouette, one lone battleship, moving with purpose. Japanese heavy guns and long-lance torpedoes answered, sprays of water rising around Washington as shells and wakes reached for her. But Lee had not raced forward to simply trade hits at arm's length. Using the same radar that guided his aim, he could also follow torpedo patterns and enemy maneuvers. Orders rang quietly, precisely: adjust course, alter speed, keep Washington just outside the most dangerous convergences. She heeled into her turn, a vast shape responding with surprising agility. Torpedoes passed ahead and astern, some uncomfortably close, leaving white scars of foam across the black surface, but found no hull. Kirishima, by contrast, could not evade. Her unintentional circle tightened. Fire control interruptions and repeated shocks made coordinated reply harder with every passing minute. Washington's big rifles continued their measured work until the Japanese battleship's offensive power was effectively spent. The moment that had begun as a near trap for Lee's fragile force had flipped. One American battleship, unseen and underestimated, had used radar and discipline to neutralize the heaviest unit in an enemy fleet in a matter of minutes. And still Washington was not done. As Kirishima lost way and slipped out of the immediate equation, Washington's directors began stepping to new targets. Enemy cruisers that had moments earlier believed themselves part of a surrounding net now found themselves illuminated on US radar as distinct, manageable problems. Lee's voice remained even. There was no speech, no dramatic flourish. Only the next coordinates, the next bearing, the next opportunity. In that controlled calm lay the secret of why this ship, and this night, should have reshaped doctrine, and why, frustratingly, they did not. Admiral Conde felt the change before he fully understood its source. His plan had assumed American hesitation with heavy units, assumed the night and long-lance torpedoes would once again tilt the odds. Instead, his lead battleship was compromised, his formation scattered by unexpected long-range precision, and a new opponent, fast, accurate, and confident, was dictating the rhythm. Washington's main battery shifted smoothly from Kirishima to the nearest threatening silhouettes. Salvos walked toward cruiser-sized targets, forcing evasive turns, disrupting any thought of a coordinated final run on Henderson Field. Every course change made under that pressure threw Japanese firing solutions and torpedo patterns further out of alignment. Lee, watching the plot, saw what mattered most. The enemy was no longer driving south in a purposeful lane. They were bending away, fragmenting, reacting. The trap for the airfield was gone. There is a temptation, in retelling, to imagine Washington as invulnerable, but on her decks that night no one felt that way. They saw columns of water close aboard, felt the hull reverberate with her own salvos, knew that a single well-placed torpedo or plunging shell could turn mastery into crisis. Damage control teams stood ready through every exchange. Gun crews worked under the knowledge that the wrong kind of surprise could arrive at any second. What made the difference was not invincibility but coherence. Where many surface actions off Guadalcanal had dissolved into confusion, ships losing track of friends and opponents, Washington used radar to keep her mental map intact. She knew who was where, in real time, even when eyes on deck could not. Conde did not have that clarity. To him, the American formation appeared and disappeared between glare and shadow, their exact number uncertain. The weight of fire landing on Kirishima suggested more than one battleship. Cruiser officers, seeing their flagship under heavy strikes, imagined an entire US battle line where in reality there was one effective unit. When Washington's secondary battery opened on closer contacts that ventured too near, the psychological effect intensified. To Japanese crews, it felt as if they had stumbled into a layered trap rather than a single ship counterstroke. Recognizing the loss of initiative and anxious not to sacrifice more heavy units so far from secure support, Conde made the only rational decision left to him. He ordered withdrawal. Under covering maneuvers and smoke, Japanese cruisers and destroyers began to edge back to the northwest, abandoning the original mission to neutralize Henderson Field. The transports waiting with thousands of troops and vital equipment would not receive a clear corridor this night. Washington, low in the water with spent powder and the residue of her own output drifting in the air, held course long enough to ensure the retreat was real rather than a feint. Only then did Lee consider a deeper chase. For a moment, history balanced on an odd detail. American patrol torpedo boats in the area, keyed up by earlier nights of confusion, had been ordered to challenge unknown large contacts. With radio nets cluttered and recognition procedures strained, there was a genuine risk those small, aggressive craft might mistake Washington for an intruder. Lee broke his preferred silence to send a concise identification. The message, firm, almost dry in tone, cleared the way. But it also underlined a persistent truth. Sometimes the limits on what a ship can do come not from the enemy, but from friendly uncertainty. By dawn, the picture was undeniable. Kirishima was gone from the surface, left behind as a drifting, final outline before slipping beneath. Japanese transports that attempted to press on in daylight met a different gauntlet. Aircraft from Henderson Field, now very much intact, and Allied surface units converging through clear weather. Most were intercepted. Only a fraction of the intended reinforcements reached shore, and those without the bulk of their equipment. The last serious attempt to overwhelm Guadalcanal from the sea had been broken. And yet, as Washington steamed away for repairs and new orders, her story began its peculiar slide into the margins. Officially, she had done exactly what battleships were supposed to do in theory: arrive at the critical point, outfight a comparable opponent, protect a vital position. Unofficially, this created discomfort. Public narrative and internal doctrine had already begun to crown the carrier as the uncontested centerpiece of modern naval power. Admitting that one old-fashioned gun platform, properly handled with modern tools, had changed the fate of a campaign on its own did not fit neatly. So Washington was praised, but cautiously. The action was labeled defensive. The more radical lesson, that radar-directed gunnery and independent surface maneuver could turn a single fast battleship into a dominant force at night, was noted in reports, but not allowed to reorder priorities. The ship herself moved on, as ships do, to the next assignment. She would screen carriers in the Central Pacific, providing an umbrella of anti-aircraft fire so dense that attacking pilots later described it as an almost continuous wall. She would use her 16-inch guns to soften island fortifications ahead of landings, her salvos landing miles inland with the same kind of calculated precision shown at Guadalcanal, only now against fixed coordinates instead of maneuvering warships. Campaign after campaign, she was present. Gilbert Islands, Marshalls, Marianas, the Philippines, later operations closer to the Japanese home islands. Battle stars accumulated quietly along her record. What did not accumulate were dramatic headlines. Other battleships would gain renown for symbolic moments: the signing ceremony, the surprise strike survived, the museum berth in a famous harbor. Washington's great test had come early, in dark water, against long odds, and had ended so cleanly for her own crew that it was almost too tidy a story. No catastrophic hit. No heroic damage control saga. No singular public image to hang a legend on. Just near-flawless execution in the one scenario that should have silenced any claim that battleships were merely passive shields. As the war grew larger and faster, that quiet perfection proved surprisingly easy to overlook. By early 1943, Washington had become something paradoxical, the proof that big guns plus new technology could still rule a surface fight, and at the same time a workhorse quietly reassigned to roles where that proof would rarely be tested again. Her reputation inside the fleet was very different from the thin recognition in official communiques. Sailors talked. Word traveled between crews far faster than classified reports. In wardrooms and mess lines, officers and ratings trading stories about Guadalcanal kept circling back to the same point. Washington had gone in, done the job cleanly, and come out without losing a single man to enemy fire. That spotless record was not seen as luck by those who understood what happened that night. It was treated as the direct result of how she was handled: disciplined use of radar, refusal to stumble into close-range chaos, and a commander who treated technology as an extension of his own aim rather than an optional aid. When she joined the fast carrier task forces, that same mindset came with her. To many outside observers, her silhouette in those formations made her look like a bodyguard. Heavy armor and thick barbettes flanking ships that carried the true offensive punch, aircraft. But below decks, she was evolving into something more modern, a node in an integrated system. Her air search and fire control radars tied into combat information centers where officers watched scopes instead of horizons. Data from picket destroyers, scout planes, and other capital ships could be combined to form a single picture. When enemy aircraft probed the perimeter, Washington's guns did not fire blindly into the sky. They fired where plotted tracks predicted attackers would be seconds later. Her 5-inch guns, now frequently using proximity-fused ammunition, turned approach corridors into zones of intense risk for incoming pilots. Her lighter batteries, coordinated by directors, stitched patterns that forced attackers to break early and rush their runs. Time after time, raids that might have crippled carriers or transports instead were broken up or blunted, with Washington's measured output forming a significant part of the shield. The same logic applied: see clearly, shoot first, avoid the kind of close-range surprise that had shattered unprepared ships in 1942. When called upon for shore bombardment, she brought the same precision to land targets. Island ridges, caves, gun positions, supply dumps, coordinates were fed into her rangekeepers. Corrections from spotter aircraft were folded into new solutions. Salvos walked forward systematically, neutralizing strongpoints before landing craft approached. For troops watching from the waterline, the effect felt almost unreal. Vast bursts inland exactly where requested, as if some invisible surveyor had traced the arcs by hand. To planners, this was naval gunfire support, one tool among many. To the Marines and soldiers who advanced behind those patterns, it was reassurance. Someone offshore not only heard their calls, but could translate them into reliable action. Still, none of this translated into the kind of singular fame that attaches to symbols. Missouri would be remembered for the surrender ceremony, other ships for surviving spectacular hits or for their transformation into museums. Washington had no such defining photograph, no tourist-accessible deck to anchor her tale. Instead, her achievements remained embedded in statistics and scattered recollections. 13 battle stars. Repeated participation in frontline operations from the Atlantic to Okinawa. And through all of it, a unique and improbable note. In direct combat against the enemy, ships, aircraft, coastal batteries, no crew member lost to hostile action. There were close calls. There were splinters, shockwaves, and long watches under threat. There were accidents and the ordinary hazards of machinery and sea. But in those violent years, the ship that had once slid alone into a night filled with hostile guns remained untouched by a single enemy blow that cost a life aboard. That record is easy to shrug off on paper. It is harder to dismiss when you imagine hundreds of families who never received the telegram they might have, simply because their ship's leaders insisted on fighting in a way that maximized vision and minimized unnecessary risk. It is precisely the kind of quiet success that often passes unnoticed by institutions searching for dramatic stories. When the war finally tilted decisively in Allied favor, Washington's trajectory revealed as much about bureaucracy as it did about steel. Admiral Lee, elevated to lead the fast battleships, continued to push concepts born from that first hard proof off Guadalcanal: use of radar to shape engagements before the enemy understood the geometry, employment of large gun ships as autonomous decision-makers in the dark rather than as tethered escorts. On paper, few disagreed with his results. In practice, the gravitational pull of carrier doctrine was overwhelming. The Pacific had been transformed by long-range aviation. Victories at Midway, in the Marianas, and later in the Philippines were framed, accurately, in broad strokes, as triumphs of carrier air groups and submarines. Within that narrative, the battleship's new role seemed self-evident: glide behind, offer anti-aircraft fire, level shore defenses. Respectable, essential work, but no longer the centerpiece. For Washington, this meant her most radical accomplishment: that clear demonstration that one radar-equipped battleship could outmaneuver and outfight a superior surface force at night was reclassified in institutional memory as an outlier. Internal papers where Lee detailed streamlined radar-to-gunfire workflows, emphasized decisive beyond-visual range shots, and urged standardized training for all surface units existed. Some younger officers read them attentively, but they rarely translated into service-wide transformation before jets and missiles rendered the gunnery revolution less urgent in the eyes of planners. The pattern is familiar in military history. Innovations pioneered in crisis, by individuals willing to trust their instruments and instincts before the culture catches up, often see partial adoption overshadowed by the next wave of technology. Instead of being recognized as foundational, they are treated as clever interim tricks. Washington's fate after 1945 underlined that disconnect. She helped bring veterans home in Operation Magic Carpet, then slid quietly into reserve. There was no public campaign to save her as a monument, no insistence that the ship that had arguably secured the first major offensive foothold in the Pacific deserved a preserved berth. When her turn came, she was sold, dismantled, reformed into anonymous metal. The battleship that had shown how to merge analog computation, radar sensing, and disciplined leadership into a cohesive fighting organism left no hull for visitors to walk. Yet her influence did not disappear. The core principles demonstrated by Washington and Lee, continuous sensor fusion, direct pipelines from detection to fire control, trust in calculated solutions over guesswork, became the invisible backbone of later naval systems. What Aegis and modern combat direction centers now do digitally at lightning speed is conceptually the same pattern Lee wired together with cables and training drills. Track everything. Classify. Assign priorities. Engage before the opponent fully understands they are under accurate observation. Washington had been a proof-of-concept platform for that mindset. The irony, the sharp, lingering one, is that her very success in making advanced gunnery feel effortless helped obscure how extraordinary it was. Because she avoided spectacular damage, there was no visual record of her resilience tested to the limit. Because her great victory was swift and one-sided once she committed, it lacked the dramatic symmetry of mutual pounding that storytellers gravitate toward. She made the impossible look tidy. And so, as decades passed, her story narrowed to a footnote for specialists, overshadowed by carriers, by more photogenic battleships, and by the understandable focus on turning points labeled in bold on maps. But the logic of that November night still speaks clearly to anyone who looks closely. One ship, in the hands of people who genuinely understood their tools, changed the outcome of an entire campaign. Not by luck. Not by waiting for perfect conditions. By trusting new technology sooner than their opponents, by refusing to let doctrine downgrade them to spectators, and by acting with calculated boldness when the moment arrived. If Washington's guns had spoken only once in that way, her story would already be remarkable. But the deeper significance lies in what that engagement revealed about where true advantage comes from, and why institutions so often look away from the answer. Willis Lee did not ask permission from theory to do what he did. He had watched earlier night battles degenerate into chaos because commanders trusted optics, hunches, and tradition more than the glowing scopes that quietly outperformed all three. He had seen how slow relays and layered reporting chains turned radar from a sharp instrument into a blurred suggestion. So he cut steps. He wired operators directly into decision. He rehearsed until numbers on screens translated instantly into elevation, bearing, and timing. He trained his people to believe the data before they saw the silhouettes. Washington was, in effect, running a compact, analog version of a modern network combat system at a time when many flag officers still treated radar as an auxiliary gadget. That is what made her underrated. Not just that she fought well, but that she previewed a way of fighting the Navy itself hesitated to embrace. After Guadalcanal, opportunities to repeat that kind of demonstration were rare. The enemy surface fleet appeared less often in conditions where a single battle line could meaningfully close. Most decisive blows came from aircraft at long range. When Japanese surface groups did sortie later in the war, command choices placed other formations in the spotlight. Yet inside war diaries, fragments remain. Reports noting how Washington's early detection drew timely fighter cover. Notes from landing forces praising the punctual, accurate fall of her salvos on targets inland. Technical evaluations quietly confirming the reliability of her fire control arrangements. None read like legend. All read like competence so consistent that it faded into the background. This is the hidden cost of doing the job almost too well. Drama drains away, replaced by trust. Her crew felt that trust. New sailors came aboard knowing this was not a ship defined by tragic chapters, but by a pattern of going into hard places and returning with everyone still accounted for. That kind of record shapes behavior. It encourages meticulous maintenance, serious drills, the small daily decisions that keep systems sharp. Washington did not need slogans painted on her guns. Her culture was her emblem. Take the work seriously, take the tools seriously, take nothing for granted. As the Pacific War moved toward its closing acts, she kept that standard without demanding attention. Other names would fill headlines. She remained the ship whose importance you grasp only when you trace cause and effect carefully instead of just counting photographs. What makes Washington the most underrated American battleship of World War II is not simply that she was scrapped while others became monuments, or that her greatest night is less famous than others. It is that she quietly answered questions her own institution was reluctant to ask. Could a battleship, in an era racing toward aviation, still decide a campaign by intelligent use of new tools? She had already shown it could. Could radar and computation, when treated as central instead of supplemental, overturn an opponent's carefully honed strengths in visibility, torpedoes, and night training? Her victory off Guadalcanal was that answer in practical form. Could one well-led, well-prepared ship offset numerical disadvantage without trading lives for symbolism? Her intact crew list after some of the hardest operations of the war stands as evidence. And yet, once those questions were proven, inertia flowed around them. Post-war strategy moved toward missiles, jets, satellites. The battleship gun became a symbol of a closing era. Washington was retired not because she had failed, but because history's next phase did not need her shape. So why tell her story now? Because the pattern that shaped her fate has not gone away. Any force in any age faces the same tension. Listen to the operators who make new tools sing, or listen to the comfort of established doctrine that explains yesterday's victories. Reward safe narratives, or pay attention to the uncomfortable demonstration that one ship, one team, using technology differently, can outperform expectations. Washington and Willis Lee sit squarely on the side of uncomfortable proof. Their approach foreshadowed exactly how modern navies now fight: sensors fused, decisions rapid, weapons guided by computation more than by eyesight. The principles that feel obvious on today's screens were once experimental choices made in a dark pilot house, while most of the world still trusted searchlights. That is why obscurity does them a disservice. Not because they need sentiment, but because forgetting them makes it easier to repeat the same institutional mistake, assuming that the breakthrough already demonstrated at the edge of doctrine is a curiosity, not a blueprint. Walk through any contemporary combat information center and you are, in a sense, standing inside Washington's legacy. Track symbols, predictive plots, engagement envelopes, integrated control. These are refinements of a logic she proved at full scale when it was still considered risky. Her hull is gone. Her name does not frame famous ceremonies, but her reality remains clear for anyone willing to look past the marquee stories. She was the ship that entered a stretch of ocean already littered with friendly wrecks, faced a force that outnumbered and outgunned her escort, and turned that night into a one-sided lesson in what happens when you trust the right ideas early. The most underrated battleship is not the one that never had the chance to fight. It is the one that fought exactly once in the role it was born for, did it nearly perfectly, saved an entire campaign, influenced the architecture of future warfare, and was then quietly set aside because acknowledging how far ahead she was would have meant admitting how slow everyone else had been to follow. Remembering her does more than honor a ship and her crew. It reminds us that real turning points are often quiet, technical, and precise, carried out by people who are too busy doing things right to pause for applause, and that history only calls them underrated when we are late catching up to what they already proved.